Now, in this unit, we're starting to learn about evolution and specifically right now, natural selection. And it's possible that you have heard of Charles Darwin before. He is called the father of evolution, which is a little misleading because it makes it sound like he came up with the idea of evolution, but he did not. So evolution is this idea that organisms change through time. And that idea and concept had been around for well before Darwin. In fact, his grandfather was a big proponent of evolution, but nobody had an idea of how that happened and couldn't explain how do organisms change through time. We think that's happening, but we don't know the mechanism. Well, Charles Darwin is the first one to come up with an explanation that has held the test of time, if you will. So his ideas first started to develop on his trip around the world. He had an unusual experience where he got to ride on I think it was like a 5-year journey around the world, and he was on this boat as a passenger for the captain. So he wasn't really there for work. He was an educated man, and the captain wanted someone else educated to talk with, and he was a naturalist. So he thought, oh, this would be great. I could see things. And while he was on this trip, he was collecting samples and sending them back to England. He was, drawing pictures, making observations. So the fact that he had this really unusual experience to see a lot of the world where people didn't travel that much back then in the, 1800s. So his trip on the HMS Beagle was a big influence. And on that trip, he noticed several things. He noticed that species varied locally, globally, and over time. So the Galapagos finches, so the Galapagos Islands is a set of islands off the coast of South America, right about here. He observed that there were a lot of birds that looked very similar, but they were different. So they were varying. So varying means like had differences, but in a very local area. But he also saw that organisms varied like globally on the continents, the different continents that he got to see. He saw that there were species that were kind of similar to other species, but different. They still had these differences about them, but still the anteater in Australia looked kind of like this other anteater in South America, but different. And he noticed that organisms varied over time. He was able to be exposed to different fossils of organisms and things that you don't see alive anywhere. But in this example here, he saw that this prehistoric rodent-looking thing looked a lot like an armadillo today. So, they're similar but different, but living in different times. So he got to, see all these things, made him scratch his head, and then he went home and, pondered his thoughts and his notes. And there were things happening in society, things outside of biology that also influenced him. And yes, your lesson does not cover any of this, but I think it's important stuff to know and understand. Um, Geologists during that time were arguing that the Earth was older than people thought. I think people thought it was around 5,000 years old. And there's no way that all these different layers and the layers could be moved in that manner could have happened in just 5,000 years. Earth has to be older than that. At that time, there was a well-known economist named Thomas Malthus, and he had this theory about how when resources are limited, that populations struggle and that people struggle to survive. Malthus was talking about humans and observing things that were happening in the human population and cultures. But Darwin took that idea of limited resources and a struggle for existence and applied it to the natural world, to organisms. And Darwin was also observing and noticing what farmers were doing during that time, which was selective breeding. So farmers would choose which organisms they wanted, which, individuals, whether it was a plant or a cow, they were choosing which ones to breed to create the next generation. based on traits that they liked, based on desirable traits, whether it was a cow that made more milk, or maybe this plant had really big flowers and buds, and people liked that at the store more. So farmers were choosing, they were doing what's called artificial selection or selective breeding. Those terms mean the same thing. They were choosing things that they liked. So Darwin thought, well, maybe nature could be choosing. Now there is a question on the quick check asking about like what animal did Darwin's natural selection theory was it based on? And the answers in the quick check is the Galapagos finches and the differences in their beak shape, so their beak morphology. But I want you to understand that it was a lot more than just this. This was just one of the things that he saw and witnessed. There were so many other things that he observed and that helped him develop his idea of natural selection. All right, so natural selection, again, this is an explanation of how evolution occurred, okay, how organisms are changing through time. And the idea is, and we call it like in layman terms, the survival of the fittest. So organisms with the best traits, that nature is choosing organisms with the best traits, and those organisms get to survive and reproduce, and their offspring will most likely have those traits as well. So those good traits become more common in the next generation, and so on and so forth. And with each generation, there's some selection. So that's survival of the fittest, and where fittest or fitness is the ability to survive and reproduce. Both of those are important things for natural selection. You have to be able to live, outrun your predators, blend in, get the food better than others that you're competing with. So you have to be able to survive. But if you're not reproducing, you have a low fitness if you can't pass on those good traits. On the flip side, there's some organisms that don't live very long, like think of insects, but in that time that they're alive, they reproduce a lot. They have a high fitness. So for selection, natural selection to work, some things are required. One, you have to have a struggle for existence. There has to be a limited amount of resources where not all organisms are going to be able to survive and reproduce. You have to have differences in the population. If ever all the organisms are exactly the same, there's nothing that natural selection can work on. And those differences, or that variability, needs to affect fitness. So those differences need to give them an advantage to help them survive better or reproduce more. And those differences need to be heritable, meaning that they can be passed on to the next generation. Because if it can't be passed on, then there's no natural selection. There's no changing the next generation. Now, again, your lesson talks about some researchers, the Grants, Dr. Grants, Doctors Grants, Peter and Mary, and they worked in the Galapagos Islands studying Darwin's finches, and that's what they're called now. They are important to his ideas, but they're not the only thing. But they studied Darwin's finches over years, so a long period of time to help verify his results. And again, they found data to help verify his results. They looked at, some of the things they looked at. They looked at a lot of different things, but one of the things they looked at was beak size, and keeping track of that through the different time and generations, and what was going on with the weather in the area and what sort of seeds were around. And in this graph, so this graph, and graphs are a great way to depict data visually. So you can visualize the data, you can see relationships between variables. In this graph, we're looking at beak depth, so how long it is, and the year, so beak depth through time. And then they've put in some notes of when it was a dry year, so when there wasn't as much rain. And what they notice is that in dry years, so there's certain plants that don't survive, so their seeds aren't around. In dry years, there are larger seeds. The ones that do survive are the plants with larger seeds. And what they see is that beak depth is increasing. And then they had a record of a wet year and beak depth decrease because there's a lot more of the smaller seeds available, so there's no selection for the bigger beak to eat the bigger seeds. So this is used as an example of, in your lesson, as an example of something that verified Darwin's study. There's been lots of things that have helped, and the fact that at the time Darwin had no idea how traits were passed on, and he didn't know Mendel's work, and but now that everyone knows both of them, it does work well together, and they support each other. All right, so let's talk a little bit about adaptations. That's another important term in the world of natural selection and evolution. So adaptations are a trait that gives the individual a survival advantage in a certain environment. So an adaptation is something that increases the fitness of the organism. So it gives it a chance to survive or reproduce. So an adaptation can be both physical or it could be behavioral. And adaptations are specific to that environment. So if the environment is different, there's going to be different adaptations for that environment. One trait might not be advantageous in one environment, but advantageous in another. Now, some examples from your lessons, from the lesson. A physical adaptation, one of the examples was with the peppered moths. So these are moths that live in birch trees, which are kind of a white tree with some dark colors on it, but mostly white. And normally you would see just white moths, and there's a mutation out there where some of them become dark, but there weren't very many of them because obviously they stood out and the predator would eat them. Well, during the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of coal being burnt and soot putting into the atmosphere, and that was landing on the birch tree and making it dark instead of white. And people then started to notice that the dark moth became more common, and every generation there were less and less white moths. So that the environment changed, and the thing that was an adaptation, the thing that gave it an advantage for survival, changed. And we saw that happen in the population. And now we know that the genetics, that gene became more common. Behavior can be an adaptation too. So your lesson talks about again, Darwin's finches and how on the islands, they didn't have any predators. So they weren't scared of things. They didn't have any predator defenses. They didn't fly away. People could just come up and basically grab the birds. But as people came there, invasive organisms came with them, things like birds and rats that preyed on the finches or their eggs. So when those individuals came, there was a decrease in the species abundance. So there was a decrease in the finches through the years. Okay, so an increase in our predators or invasive predators, introduced predators, and we see a decrease in the abundance of the finch. But one thing that they noted, the people who were there, is that the birds that were there started to have did have a predator avoidance behavior, that they would fly away. You could not catch them as easily as you could before. So the ones that were still there were the ones that had a adaptation, a trait of being a little bit more skittish. So they could survive. Having that skittish thing is a behavioral adaptation. They could survive, they could reproduce, pass on that gene for behavior. Now again, for any of this to work, for natural selection to work, these traits have to be inheritable. And we've learned about two different ways that traits can be inheritable through genetics or epigenetics. So remember, genetics is when there's differences in the DNA structure, the actual DNA structure, so the A's, T's, G's, and C's, where epigenetics are when there's a difference in the expression of the DNA. So the actual sequence is the same, but the little things that are on top of the DNA, the little chemical tags or things that are on the proteins that DNA is wrapped around, those are different and they change the expression, but that changes the phenotype. Both of these can be passed on to your offspring. Genetic changes, so mutations and things through meiosis, actually are slower to come about and occur, whereas epigenetic changes are faster. So you can get evolution happen on a faster level when epigenetic changes are happening. All right, that is all. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions.